The rural Dionysia is so ancient that we cannot even tell when it began from the sources. It just seems to have always existed as long as ancient records were kept. It was also known as a lesser Dionysia, and the city Dionysia was known as the Great Dionysia, which was held during the spring equinox. Once again, just like clockwork, we have another winter solstice festival with ties to a spring equinox festival, just like Christmas and Easter, just like the Akitu festival and the Tibetu festivals in Babylon were tied together, just as the Egyptians connected the birth of Horus with the resurrection of Osiris. And here we have two festivals with the same name, same general rites in Greater and Lesser Dionysia in honor of the sun, Dionysus and Apollo. Are you noticing a pattern yet? I also forgot to mention, in regards to the Egyptians celebrating the birth of Horus on December 25th and the resurrection of Osiris on April 25th, you might be wondering if this had any influence over the Romans. The answer is yes. Romans had an annual festival known as the Serapis that is shown on Roman calendars on April 25th at the spring equinox, as early as the 2nd century through the 3rd century sources, and is thus replaced by Easter in the 4th and 5th centuries. And Serapis is a Hellenized form of the god Osiris, who was also syncretized with Dionysus, Zeus, and Dis Pater, as well as Pluto. Tacitus and Plutarch tell the story of how this god came to be. The origin of this god, Serapis, has not hitherto been made generally known by our writers. The Egyptian priests give this account, while Ptolemy, the first Macedonian king who consolidated the power of Egypt, was setting up in the newly built city of Alexandria fortifications, temples, and rites of worship. There appeared to him in his sleep a youth of singular beauty and more than human stature, who counseled the monarch to send his most trusty friends to Pontus and fetch his effigy from that country. This, he said, would bring prosperity to the realm, and great and illustrious would be the city which gave it a reception. At the same moment, he saw the youth ascend to heaven in a blaze of fire. Roused by so significant and strange an appearance, Ptolemy disclosed the vision of the night to the Egyptian priest, whose business it is to understand such matters. As they knew but little of Pontus or of foreign countries, he inquired of Timotheus, an Athenian, one of the family of the Eumolpids, whom he had invited from Eleusis to preside over the sacred rites, what this worship was, and who was the deity. Timotheus, questioning persons who had found their way to Pontus, learned that there was a city of Sinope, and near it a temple, which, according to an old tradition of the neighborhood, was sacred to the infernal Jupiter. For there also stood close at hand a female figure, to which many gave the name Proserpina. Tacitus Histories. Infernal Jupiter is none other than Dis Pater, a god equated with Pluto, but not in a one-to-one sense, but with much overlap, but also with Bacchus, Hades, and Osiris. Ptolemy was creating a new imperial priesthood, as stated in the previous passage, that included priests from the divine family of the Eleusinian Hierophants, known to the world as the Yaobakoi, but as we will see in the next passage, includes other sacred rites from Asia Minor and the Near East too. Ptolemy sent for this statue, who the god told him to find in the city of Sinope in Pontus. Tacitus relates a miracle that supposedly occurred in which this statue comes to life and boards onto a ship by himself and travels for 3 days from Turkey to Egypt. The story becomes at this point more marvelous and relates that the god of his own will conveyed himself on board the fleet, which had been brought close to shore, and, wonderful to say, vast as was the extent of sea that they traversed, they arrived at Alexandria on the 3rd day. A temple proportioned to the grandeur of the city was erected in a place called Rakotis, where there had stood a chapel consecrated in old times to Serapis and Isis. Such is the most popular account of the origin and introduction of the god Serapis. Tacitus goes on to say, the god himself, because he heals the sick, many identified with Asclepius, others with Osiris, the deity of the highest antiquity among these nations, a few with Jupiter as being supreme ruler of all things, but most people with Pluto, arguing from the emblems which may be seen on his statues or from the conjectures of their own Tacitus histories. The reason why I think this is important to Saturnalia in Roman religion is because it highlights the level of religious syncretism that was on the rise in the Roman religion during the Common Era. Christianity is not exempt from this movement of religious syncretism that was taking place at this time. When we look at the midwinter celebrations of the winter solstice, Sol Invictus and Saturn are blended together, and the celebrations of Saturnalia blend into the solstice veneration, as we will see with the Roman Brumalia. Dionysus and Saturn, grandson and grandfather, have much in common. Both chthonic gods, agricultural gods, both of them bring equality to the classes and are thus invoked through revelry and divine mania. The Lesser Dionysia was a Greek winter solstice vine festival, similar to the Thesmophoria, in which sacred games were played, drinking and festivities occurred, young girls carrying baskets and offerings, and procession of the phalloi. People sang and danced, and choruses chanted Bacchic hymns and performed dithyrambs and paeans in honor of Bacchus and Apollo. Romans also venerated Dionysus during the winter solstice. When it comes to Rome, most people know a lot about Saturnalia, and many know about the birthday of Sol Invictus on December 25th, which I will talk about later. But less people know about the calends of Janus, which is also a time of festivities, merrymaking, greenery, closing of businesses, and celebrating the new year. But what most people don't actually talk about as much, surprisingly, was a widespread Roman festival that took place in between the Saturnalia and the New Year's, known as Brumalia. Literally means midwinter in Latin. A minor holiday of Bruma on November 24th took place, which reminds me of a Thanksgiving like in America, sparking off the holiday season at the end of November. But an even bigger festival of Brumalia took place during the winter solstice, long before Sol Invictus was given his own holiday, and also long before Christianity even existed. 1st century BCE, Varro writes, Bruma is so named because then the day is brevissimus, shortest, the solstice, because on that day, Sol, sun, seems to sit still or halt on which it is nearest to us. Varro. Apparently, cutting down trees was a rite of passage for this holiday, according to Cato. Oak wood and also wood for vine props is ripe for cutting at the time of the winter solstice. Other species which bear seed are ripe when the seeds are mature, while those which are seedless are ripe when they shed bark. Cato explains the ritual of cutting down trees at a winter solstice. Many scholars will say that the act of hanging up pine trees is something that only seems to exist in modern times, but the pagan sources of the ancient world seem to do this rite for certain celestial events such as equinoxes and solstices, and even Christian authors were aware of this. Firmicus Maternus, in the era of the pagan religion, states, in the Phrygian sacred rites of her whom they call the mother of the gods, a pine tree is cut every year, and an image of a youth is fastened on the middle of the tree. Reeds carried by the College of the Canophori, probably designed to recall the birth, exposure, and rescue of baby Attis on the banks of the river Sangarius. Julian. On this day, the Brotherhood of the Dendrophori, tree carriers, cut a pine and carried it into the temple of Magna Mater on the Palatine Hill in Rome. This was a day of mourning. They advanced the claim that he whom they buried at a little while earlier had come to life again. His resurrection is the sprouting of the scattered seeds and the annual turn of the seasons. Firmicus Maternus. Arnobius, in his text called Against the Nations, says, what of the little branches of the tree decked and girt round with garlands of violets? Do they not signify how the mother adorned the pine with the earliest blossoms as a memorial and testimony of her sad misfortune. What is the meaning of the galley with her hair disheveled, beating their breasts with their hands? Do they not commemorate the sorrow with which the tower-bearing mother, together with the tearful Agdestus, lamented the boy? What is the meaning of the fasting from bread, to which you have given the term castus? Is it not an imitation of the time when in poignancy of her grief the divinity abstained from Ceres' fruit? This Holy Week for Attis, celebrating during the spring equinox, starts off bringing in pine trees and reeds, decorating the temple of the Great Mother with greenery, and decorating the trees with images, and placing an image of Attis on top of the tree, similar to placing an angel on the top of a Christmas tree. The 22nd of March, which marks a day of mourning called the Day of Blood, which is the day that Attis dies, and is followed 3 days later by a day of rejoicing, celebrating the resurrection of Attis as the Great Mother makes him into a god. You can't make this stuff up. We literally have a death of a god, followed by a resurrection after 3 days, just like Jesus, during the same exact week as Jesus. For some reason, many academics don't find this to be considerable enough to possibly be an influence on the Christian story of Jesus and the celebration of Easter, but I digress. But as I have laid out in this video, the spring equinox is universally tied to the winter solstice due to both dates marking the rise of the sun over darkness, as why the Greeks celebrated the lesser Dionysia and the greater Dionysia on the winter solstice and spring equinox. And it's why we see the Egyptians holding these 2 days above all others. Christians who calculated the death and birth of Christ to be on these exact 2 days would know this, and this cannot be a coincidence. What does that pine tree mean when you introduce on appointed days into the sanctuary of the Mother of the Gods? Is it not symbolic of that tree under which the mad and unhappy youth laid hands on himself, in which the parent of the gods consecrated as solace for her grief? What is the meaning of the fleeces of wool with which you bind and surround the trunk of the tree? Is it not a recollection of the woolen cloths which Ea covered him with was expiring, believed that she could procure some warmth for his limbs as they grew cold? Also, Arnobius, when describing the pine tree ritual for Attis, he also states that this was done on appointed dates, which indicates that this was not only done on the spring equinox, but most likely something practiced on other dates as well. Given how I've already established the winter solstice being universally connected to the spring equinox, I think that is no way a stretch to speculate that this ritual could easily be carried out during winter solstice celebrations, just as we already found in the writings of Cato about cutting down trees on Brumalia, which fell on December 25th during the time of the Julian calendar. But Neil, the scholarly consensus is that pine tree cutting during Christmas was something that only shows up in modern times. To this I say yes, I know, and scholars are correct for pointing out that the sources only show this to be the case in later sources. I admit that I am completely speculating on where this tradition could come from. However, at least I have sources for my speculation. Cutting down pine trees is nowhere to be found in the Bible, and as I've shown, it's in quite a few pagan sources. So at the very least, scholars would have to admit that my speculation is at least possible. Christians did not start hanging up Christmas trees for a biblical reason. They did this for another reason, and in my opinion, I think it is entirely possible and likely that the syncretic rites of paganism is the best candidate. In fact, we know that Brumalia was still being celebrated all the way into the 13th century. How do I know that? Christopher of Mytilene, who lived in the 11th century, makes notes about this festival to his friend Nicephorus, who had sent him cakes around the time of the Brumalia. The celebration of Brumalia featured nocturnal festivities, decorating with greenery, wreaths, wearing ivy and berry diadems, replete with feasting, drinking, and jovial activities just like Saturnalia and just like Christmas today. Throughout the festival, interpretations of prophetic signs were considered as forecasts for the remaining of the winter season, and people would make vows for the new year. Although the 6th century emperor Justinian tried to suppress pagan practices, records such as those by Christopher of Mytilene indicate that this holiday persisted at least until the 13th century. Documentation of the festival ceases following the sack of the capital in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade. It is only after the sack of Constantinople in the 13th century that this festival would cease entirely. But given how influential Romans were over their European neighbors, it is entirely likely that the festivities of Brumalia blended together with the Christmas tide. And given how Saturnalia was blended with Brumalia in later Roman sources, we can easily see how Saturnalia and Christmas would be blended together as well. It is generally agreed that the pagan gods were viewed in the same way that Christians today would view a comic book hero like Superman or Thor. They don't worship them or believe in them, but could get entertainment and enjoy reading about them and making depictions of them in paintings and sculptures. In fact, many historians believe that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is what led to the Renaissance era. Many of the Greeks who fled the Ottomans throughout the 15th century went west to Italy and Venice and brought with them Greek culture, which venerated the old pagan gods in artwork, something that was not as popular among Germanic and Latin Christians. When the Latin Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they melted down gold and silver statues of Aphrodite and Zeus and destroyed ancient pagan relics that the Byzantines held onto. Given how much the Byzantines influenced Europeans in later times, especially Eastern Europeans, I think that it's safe to bet that among the lower classes, many of these ancient pagan rites survive. Take the Greek magical papyri, for example. These are a collection of random texts that span across many centuries, and they show a blending of culture and religious ideas being done by normal everyday devotees of gods. Outside of ordained priesthoods, people do what they want, and New Age movements are nothing new.